Welcome back. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how we can write HTML in a separate file, and we can send that file back in the response rather than what we've been doing so far using res.send. There are three main objectives here. The first is to use res.render to render HTML, to send back a file from an EJS file, and that will make more sense once we talk about what EJS is. And that's the next objective, explain what EJS is and why we use it, and then lastly, pass variables to EJS templates. So to get started here, I'm going to need a new Express app, and I'm going to go through creating the basic Express app from scratch, which I won't continue doing in every video, but it still is pretty early on in the course, and I just want to make sure you get used to seeing it and doing it because it's something that you'll be doing nonstop. So I have a directory called More Express, where I'll be working from for this unit, and I'll make a new directory inside of that. And we'll just call this EJS demo. And then inside of EJS demo, we'll run npm init, and I'll just speed through this. So that name is fine, version is fine, description is empty. I always like to change this to app.js, just a personal preference. Hit enter a few more times. We don't need to fill any of those in. There we go. And now if we do ls, we have our package.json. Let's create our app.js, and we'll also run npm install express -- save. There we go. And now let's open up the app.js file and start adding some code in there. And rather than just doing ls and then clicking on app.js and clicking on open, I recently found another way of doing that Cloud9 recently added, which is if you type C9 space and then the name of a file or the path to a file, so C9 space app.js, that will open it up for you in the editor. It's much faster than having to type ls and then click on the file and then click on open. So let's get the basic Express code in here. So var express equals require express, and then var app equals express executed as a function. One thing that you will occasionally see is this, where someone sets var app equal to require express and then just runs it as a function immediately. Most people, though, will do it like this in two separate steps. And most commonly, you'll just see express and app, but those can be anything. Now let's get the app.listen going at the very bottom, which will start the server. So we need the port, which is process.env.port, and then process.env.ip, and those are environment variables that Cloud9 has set up that we're accessing for the port and IP address. And then I add in my callback that will run once the server has been set up, once it's listening, and we'll just do a console.log server is listening, just like that. And we'll save. Now let's add in our first route, and we will do the root route. I always like to start there, and that's always a confusing phrase to some of my students because this word that I pronounce route, some of them will pronounce as root. I try and make it very clear when I say root, I'm only talking about ROOT, as in this, the root route. Okay, so let's add that in, app.get root or slash, and then our callback function that will be run whenever a get request is made to slash, and then we'll have these two objects, request and response, and we'll go ahead and just call the res.send, and we'll just do a simple thing, welcome to the home page, just like that. Should all be review at this point. Let's start the server up. So node app.js, looks like everything's good. Let's now go to the root page here and refresh. Welcome to the home page. Obviously, this type of content, a single line of text, is pretty boring. What we can do to spruce it up a little bit is we can go back in here and make this some HTML if we wanted to, just like that. And then we can add in below that an H2 that says blah, blah, just like that. There we go. And if we save this and restart the server, and then we go back here and refresh, we get HTML that's being rendered to us, but that's still incredibly painful to actually type out an entire page. It's technically possible, but it would be so difficult. It's just not a good idea. So luckily, there's an easier way where we can write all of our code in a separate file, all the HTML that we want, all the CSS, and yes, all the front-end JavaScript that we want to send back to the user. So we can use a method called render. And that render method lives on the response object, whatever we're calling it, in our case, res. So res.render, and then we give it a name of a file, like homepage or home.html or dogs.html or something like that. And of course, we need to have that file created, and it needs to have some content in it. But even before we do that, there's a small issue. I'll get rid of this line. And the problem is, when we use Express, we don't write plain HTML files. There are ways of doing that, and it requires a little more setup, but most of our web apps aren't going to be just standard HTML static files that are sent back. What we're looking for are dynamic HTML files, which are called templates. And in the second half of this video, we'll introduce those. But for now, I'm going to go here and change this to EJS. And all that I'll say about EJS is that it stands for Embedded JavaScript, and that you'll learn a lot more about it in about 5 minutes. When a GET request is made to slash, our code will render a file called dogs.ejs, and let's change it to home, just because that makes more sense with the root route. And so we need to create that file, and we actually don't create it in the same directory as app.js. What we need to do is make a new directory called views. And that's not an arbitrary name. That's a directory that Express is going to look for. So whenever we render a file, whatever it's called, it's going to look first in the views directory and try and find this exact file inside of views. So now let's create that. So I'll do a touch views/home.ejs, just like that. And then the next thing I want to do is add some content. So let's open that file with that new C9 command, C9 views/home.ejs, and let's add some stuff in here. This is the home page. Let's fix this. And let's also add an image. And I have an image I'd like to use here. This is something called a Pomsky. It's a Pomeranian and a Husky mix. Allegedly, this is a full-grown Pomsky, which is pretty crazy if that's true. It looks like a miniaturized Husky or just a permanent Husky puppy. Anyway, so we'll copy this URL and go back. And of course, you can do any image that you'd like. You don't have to go find that or type this URL up yourself, and we'll save. And now we'll close out of this, and we should be good to go, except for missing one thing. And I'm actually going to let Express tell us what we're missing. We'll get an error message. So I'm going to clear this just to make some more room for you. And now I'm going to start the server. And when we go to the root route, it will call the render method, which will look for home.ejs inside of a directory called views. And then once it finds it, it will then take the contents and send that back in the response. So we'll go back to our app and refresh, and we get an error message here. It says cannot find module EJS. And what that means is that Express is looking for a package called EJS that it needs to use in order to render an EJS file. So we need to npm install EJS. And this will all make sense why we're using EJS in just a few minutes, but for now, just trust me, npm install EJS, and we'll do -- save. And once that finishes, we can just do node app.js again and refresh the page now. And we get, this is the home page and our adorable puppy/full-grown Pomsky. So now we have a file of HTML that we've written that we're now sending back to the user, and that's being rendered in the browser. And that's great, but this is still extremely limited for web applications. This will only send back the exact same page every single time. And in most web apps, that's not what we want. Maybe the home page is the same or the login page is the same, but then once the user has logged in, for example, there's usually a message that says, "Welcome back, Colt," or "Welcome back, adorable Pomsky puppy/adult." Let me show you what I mean with a quick example. So I'll go back and add in a new route, and our route is going to be something like /fallinlovewith, and then a thing like Rusty, and then we could also go to fall in love with a Pomsky. I think that's how it's spelled. And we want an HTML file that will show us a message that contains the variable from the route, that path parameter. So it would say something like, you fell in love with Rusty. So to do that, we need to define our app.get / fall in love with / thing is what we'll call it. And then we need our request and response inside the callback. And just like the last exercise, we'll capture thing, which will be var thing equals request.params.thing. And then we can start with a simple res.send, just like we did with the animal speaking exercise. The pig says oink, the cow says moo. We can do the same thing here. So we'll just say, you fell in love with plus thing. All right, so this is review. And if I restart the server now, and I go back, and now I go to / fall in love with / Pomsky, we get you fell in love with Pomsky, which isn't exactly grammatically correct, but then again, neither is the word Pomsky. So we'll go back, and now what we want to do is figure out how we can send an HTML file back that says you fell in love with plus and then something. We can start by creating the file, and we'll just call this file inside the views directory. You can call it whatever you want, of course, but I'll just go with love.ejs to keep it short. And then we'll fill that in. So we need C9 views / love.ejs. We have that open. And let's start by just adding in you fell in love with, and then we need to fill in the blank, but we don't know what to put here yet. So we'll just leave it like that. And let's put a note here that says, PS, this is the love.ejs file. Just so that you know it's coming from the EJS file and it's not the res.send that we have right now. In fact, I'll get rid of that. So what we'll want to do is render that file. So res.render, and the name of the file is love.ejs. It will automatically look in the views directory, which is right there. There we go. We have our two files. Let's start the server up. Node app.js. We'll restart and refresh. Okay, so our file is here, you fell in love with, and we need to fill in the blank right here. And I know this is a really simple example, which is the point. I didn't want to confuse you with something crazy just yet, but this type of logic is really important, where we can fill a template in with data coming back from a database or data that a user has provided, where it's not a static HTML file that is exactly the same every time. We basically want to add variables into HTML. And that's what EJS lets us do. So EJS stands for Embedded JavaScript. It lets us embed JavaScript code, variables, if statements, loops, inside of HTML. So it's how we could do something like you fell in love with, and then here, this won't work just yet, but we could put our variable called thing. Let's just do it in all caps, thing variable. But this won't work because it will just treat it as regular HTML and it will just show us the word thing variable. We need to do something to tell EJS that this is JavaScript code, not HTML. Treat this like JavaScript. Luckily, EJS gives us a way of doing that. It's a little bit weird when you see it for the first time. It looks like this. So we have our brackets and then percent signs and then an equal sign on the opening bracket. And whatever goes between these two brackets here is going to be treated as JavaScript. So I'll show you what I mean. We can just do something like 5 plus 5, which in regular HTML, and I'll do that actually, I'll just show you, 5 plus 5, without these EJS brackets, we'll just print 5 plus 5. But if we do it right here, we'll actually get 10 printed out. So I'll save this template, quit, or start the server again, node app.js, and refresh the page, and we get you fell in love with 5 plus 5, 10. And I totally get it. 5 plus 5, 10 is a complete catch. All right, so we'll go back. So we don't want 5 plus 5 to be printed there. What we actually want is the thing variable. We'll just call it the thing var, or let's just do thing var. And this needs to come from our code over here. So what we need to do is pass this value thing to our love.ejs template, and we want to print it out. And while we're here, I'll also get rid of the 5 plus 5. So we get you fell in love with, and then we need to define the thing var. And you might think we could just do this, var thing var equals request.params.thing, and you might be hoping that Express automatically sends all those variables somehow to this template, and it just knows about thing var. Unfortunately, that's not how it works, and I'll show you that. Restart the server. I'll get an error message, and it tells me thing var is not defined. So now I need to go back and define thing var, and the way that I do that is I actually pass it through to my love.ejs template, and I do that on the res.render line. And I pass it through as an object, and in that object I can put multiple pieces of data that I want to have in my template. So rather than thing var, I'm just going to call it thing to make this clearer. And then here I'm going to pass data through, and I'm going to say in the template, thing var should be equal to thing. What this will do is take the value of thing and stick it right here. So it will look like thing var is equal to Rusty, and then over here, thing var will be replaced, all of this would be replaced by Rusty. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. Go back here, and why don't we just start by hard coding it as Rusty? Just like that, and we'll restart the server, and I'll refresh the page, and I get you fell in love with Rusty. So rather than doing a string, the next step is just to go back to what we had, which is the entire thing variable, save, and we'll pass that through under the name thing var, and then we render that here with our EJS tags, those wonky looking things, restart the server again, go back. Now I'm getting you fell in love with Pomsky, and if I go to you fell in love with tater tots, that's also reflected here. This is a very powerful concept that we'll be using, like I said, in pretty much every app from here on out, having these dynamic pages, having HTML responses that can change depending on what the user asks for and specific pieces of data in the request. The other thing I'll show is that this is just regular JavaScript. So right here, I can do things like to uppercase, and this will be run first, and then it will return something that will be printed out, like Rusty. So it's just regular JavaScript, and we'll talk more about what should go in here and what shouldn't, because there are some rules. You don't want to clutter your HTML or your EJS template with tons and tons of JavaScript. You want to keep it to a minimum. But for now, I'll do this and save, and this will be the very last thing we do. Restart the server, refresh, and now I get a capitalized version. All right, so now let's recap everything we talked about. There's quite a bit in this lesson. First thing is that we can send back the contents of a file using res.render, like we did here and here. And those templates need to exist in the views directory. Express automatically looks there. The next thing we talked about is EJS, which stands for Embedded JavaScript, and it's what enables us to have dynamic templates, HTML that will change depending on some data that we provide. We saw that we needed to do .ejs and then have our file be called something .ejs, and then we also needed to run npm install EJS. And then the last thing is that we can use EJS brackets, which are very weird at first to type. You probably aren't used to using this part of the keyboard all that much, but they're brackets with a percentage sign and an equal. And then on the other side, it's just a percentage sign. And whatever goes inside is treated as JavaScript code first. And then whatever that code returns is then printed to the HTML. And to pass data through, we can pass an object in the res.render call, where we have key value pairs. It's just a regular JavaScript object. And in the template, we have access to the variables that we define, or the properties of the object. In this case, thing var, which is equal to whatever the value of thing is, which changes every time. And in here, we can then use thing var. Okay, so I know there's a lot in this video, a lot to digest. We'll be getting a lot more practice with these concepts, in particular EJS and the EJS brackets, and then passing data to a template is something that we'll be doing in every video from here on out.